This podcast is supported by patrons. You can find a full list of them in the description of this episode. Hello, listeners of Good Morning BSS World podcast. This is Wiktor Doktor, and this is absolutely new episode of our business talks. And this time we are going to America. My guest is from United States, and this is Charles Forsgard. Hi, Charles. How are you?
Hi, Victor. Doing great. How are you today?
Very well, very well. Where are you based?
I'm in Raleigh, North Carolina, in the southeastern part of the U.S.
And how is the weather in North Carolina in the end of December 2024?
Yeah, for us, it's a little chilly. Usually it's in the 50s here, but right now it's 43. So we're about, that's Fahrenheit. So we're about, 10 degrees colder than we usually are. What is that? That's 28, I think. But
yeah, to be honest, I believe we are in a similar situation. Today in Poland, we had below 0 Celsius. So this is already like more than chilly. It's quite cold, I would say, in here.
It's very cold. Yeah,
it's very cold. Okay, Charles, just to give our listeners and viewers some kind of an introduction, who you are and what do you do? If you could just tell us a few words about yourself.
So, what I do now is I consult with companies about how to make their sales teams work better. And that's I call that my retirement job. I've been a salesperson for 42 years. I've made my life as a salesperson since I started out in a store called Radio Shack in Cohasset, Massachusetts, just selling, electronics. And it's been a very, very gratifying career, but I retired earlier in the year because I kind of had my fill. But then since then, my phone's been ringing with people asking me, hey, can you help us out with this company or that? And I said, okay, I'll do that. And it keeps me out of bars at night, as I like to say.
So now we already know that today we will focus on sales, on the selling process and on some kind of a history of selling. And just one more question for the very, very beginning. Do companies know how to sell?
A broad answer, no. I hate to say it, but as a profession, what I consider to be selling, which is where you create demand where there was not demand before. 9 out of 10 people that call themselves salespeople, that's not what they do. Most salespeople are in a completely reactive mode, and what they're doing, which is important, is they transact business. They take an order, they massage the order, they make things go through. That's not really selling. I mean, it's an important function. It's transacting, but I tend to separate what I call selling, which is that art of creating demand, where you solve a problem for a customer that the customer didn't even know they had, and that to me is what the very, very best of the selling profession or people that do that, and just they know enough about what's going on, they add enough value for their customers that they're solving problems for them. And in so doing, they're creating demand for what they're selling.
And selling is one thing, but selling management, I would say, sales management is completely different story. Can you tell us how this sales management actually changed within the last 2 decades?
Well, I'll tell you, it's the advantage I've got with that long career is I've seen things done a lot of different ways. And I don't want to be that old gray-haired guy that says, we only did it well back in the past. But one of the things that I noticed has changed a lot, and it led to the book that I wrote on sales management, which I called Stop Kidding Yourself. The way you're managing your salespeople isn't helping them. It's a long title, I know. But the reason I wrote that book was a recognition that I came to that what I saw sales managers do wasn't what I saw them do when I was a young salesperson. When I was a young salesperson coming up, the people, I was so fortunate. I worked for people that took some young, semi-smart idiot and turned him into a decent salesperson through coaching. And that coaching was invaluable. And it made me into a decent salesperson. But what I see sales managers burdened with today is they spend so much time reporting or talking about reporting that they spend very, very little time on coaching their salespeople, which at the end of the day is the most important thing they should be doing. And I think it's actually a bit of a curse that came from now today we have data about orders and shipments and, deals in the pipeline and stuff. We never had that data back then, right? It was, so you couldn't be asked to report on all this because nobody could, measure it, which was bad. You should have been able to measure it. But there's a double-edged sword to it. Once you have the data, then people want to slice and dice it and analyze it to the nth degree. And what happens, though, unfortunately, is that often takes away from that critical function of coaching the salesperson to help them be a better salesperson. That's the biggest change I think I've seen.
Does it mean that reporting now is the biggest time consumer for the selling guys? So it means that they do more focus on actually just saying what they did or they didn't, or what were the selling opportunities, instead of just doing the right job.
Wiktor, you have just hit on one of my biggest hot buttons right now. And it goes right to the data piece, because you're right. It's people get addicted to the reports. And if you look at the biggest CRM tool out there, which is Salesforce.com, if I'm a salesperson for Salesforce, I'm not selling it to a salesperson. I'm selling it to a CEO or a chief revenue officer. And what they want is data. So they sell it to them as, here's this thing where you can see what all your people are doing, as long as you can force them to put it all into the tool. And that leads to a phenomenon that I see all the time. I frequently speak at conferences with large numbers of sales leaders. I have sales VPs all over the room. And I always open up my talks with, you talk about CRM, and I say, everybody in the room that in the last week, when you've talked to people about CRM, raise your hand if you've said the word logging. And everybody raises their hand. They've all said logging. And then I ask, all right, how many of you in the last week have used the word planning? And like 3 people will raise their hand. And that's the difference, because that's exactly what you just hit on. It becomes about logging things after the fact, which is strictly so that somebody can run a report, as opposed to planning, which is for the salesperson to be able to think about what they're doing and can I do it smart? Doing it on the front end, that planning is valuable. It's valuable to the salesperson. They're doing it for themselves to be able to sell more. If it's about logging, the salesperson will do it because they know their manager is going to hit them in the head with a stick if they don't do it, right? But they're only going to do it just not to get fired. They're not doing it for any good reason. And again, it doesn't help them sell more.
So it means that they are rather protecting their jobs rather than doing the jobs.
That's a great way to put it. You're absolutely spot on. That it's there's a line in an American movie called Office Space where the guy goes, all that's going to make me do is do just enough so that I don't get fired.
But that's not the way how the business should be done. Yeah. Okay. Today we are talking about the sales teams, but actually the same rule probably is for the operations, administration, and so on and so on. We shouldn't be afraid of being fired. Rather, we should focus on this, what should be done. So if we are now today focusing on the sales team, how actually they should run their work, their job properly. If you could give us some kind of advices of what are the must do, or let's say things to do and things to avoid, what such advices would be?
So I think the trick is, we talked about planning versus logging. And when I look at the most effective salespeople that are out there, the fundamental difference between them and the less effective salespeople is they're naturally more proactive. If I do a personality assessment, which I've done many times, there's a characteristic that always comes to the top of the top salespeople, which is initiative. If you do one of these psychological studies on the guys, you'll take a population of all your salespeople. The top salespeople always have a natural, innate goal to take the initiative, which means they're naturally proactive. They're natural planners. They take command of the situation. One of the litmus tests that I use when I'm talking to a salesperson about a deal that kind of tells me who they are about this, I'll say, well, what's your next step on the deal? And if they're a real salesperson, they say, well, I'm going to call Joe on Tuesday and I'm going to find out what's going on with this. The less effective salesperson is going to go, well, I'm waiting for Joe to call me. And that's the difference. And again, this can apply in many jobs. It's very particular to sales. You have to be taking control of it, especially if you're in a long cycle business. Most of the selling I've done in my career has been what I call long cycle consultative selling. In my last job, our average time to win a deal was 230 days, and that's after I created the deal. So it's a very long cycle process. If you're not in control of that by being proactive, you're going to miss everything. And as a management team, if I'm just measuring the outcome, which is either my revenue or my orders, I'm a year late to addressing the problem. So I've got a construct that I use with people I talk to. I call it the wheel. And it's like, well, if I'm measuring revenue, that's the most lagging item. And if I go to orders, it's still lagging, just not as much. It's just what's my lead time for the product. Before the order, I'm going to win a deal, which is what I'll do in Salesforce or whatever my CRM is. Before I do that, I've got a bunch of actions that I'm taking to drive that deal forward, right? And so if I'm measuring each of these things, now I'm working my way backwards from that revenue thing. Well, before I'm measuring the actions I'm taking on the deals, I'm going to measure the amount of creations. How many deals am I putting into the pipeline? Then I get into where do those deals come from? And where they come from is somebody making a sales visit, somebody sitting across a desk from a customer trying to sell them something. And then before that, I've got account plans. Am I executing actions on my account plans to create that visit that then creates the deal? And then before the account plan, I've got the leads I'm working. Am I actually taking the leads the company gives me, qualifying, I'm driving through it, trying to turn them into an account that now I'm going to work with more regularly. So if you go all the way back to the leads part, that's probably a year and a half before you ever get to revenue, if you're in your common kind of consultative selling world. So the way that you want to manage this is look at not just the revenue, not just the orders, but go all the way back. And of course, you're not just going to measure leads. You got to measure all these things and look at them. And whenever I find someone's behind, I can always walk backwards and I can find where the problem is. And sometimes the problem is just going to be the number of things you're doing, the number of visits. But I also got to look at the quality of the visits. And that's where coaching comes in, right? That's where I can coach you on how thoughtful was that visit? How well did I plan it? And that's the trick is if you're planning it, you're writing down before you walk into the sales visit. What do I want to accomplish in that visit? What's the outcome? If I do it well, what am I closing for, right? You might not be closing for a deal. You might just be closing for the next meeting, but I'm closing for something. And in the course of that meeting, there's a bunch of information I know I want to get from the customer. Have I written that information down? There's 3 questions I got to make sure I ask. And then what information I want to make sure I give to the customer, things he may already know he wants to know, or things I want to make sure the customer knows. If I've done that, that's a very basic plan. It's 3 questions. But if I've taken the time to write them down, I clarify it in my mind so that no matter what happens when I walk in the door with a customer, I'm going to make sure I probably come back to it because I've taken the time to write it down. And in fact, you should be able to write it in just a few sentences. The former CEO of Honeywell, Dave Cote, wrote a great book called Winning Now, Winning Later. And he has a line in it that I absolutely love where he says, if you can't say something concisely, you don't understand it. And to me, that's the art to doing these plans. It doesn't have to be a copy of War and Peace. It just needs to be, have I thought about it ahead of time? And this is where I see some of the biggest failures, Victor, with salespeople, especially more experienced salespeople. They're like, I've been doing this for 20 years. I don't need to write a plan. I'm like, what do you mean you don't need to write a plan? If you don't, now, do you have to write it and put it in Salesforce? No. But if you don't have those things clear in your head before you walk in the door, I don't think you're a professional. A professional does it. I mean, I have a brother who was an airline pilot for his whole career. I was a military pilot before the airline, but he's a pilot for his whole career. And he pretty darn good pilot. And, most pilots are, otherwise they're not a pilot anymore. But every time he took off and every time he landed, he went through a checklist. Was it because he wasn't a good pilot that he needed a checklist? No, it's because he was a good pilot that he used a checklist.
Coming back to this, what you said a few sentences ago, this is, I guess, the historical element of quality versus quantity, or rather the opposite way, quantity versus quality. Yeah? So it's not the fact that we are having millions of meetings if there is no quality standing behind them.
Right. And so sometimes somebody, they think they're doing the job well because, I'm going on a lot of sales visits, but they're not getting the result then you're either seeing the wrong people or you're saying the wrong things.
Yeah, this is something what I actually found in some of the companies, that the only reporting of the selling team is that I had X numbers of meetings. Yeah. So
Yeah.
what? Anyway, one more thing about this planning. Whenever I think about planning, I always have two things in my mind. One is short term, and the other one is long term. So when it comes to the selling teams, they should focus more on short or long term, or maybe on both in the same way. And another question to this: how long in advance those actions or activities should be planned?
All right. So you're hitting on a huge point, right? Salespeople naturally are very good at short-term planning. Most salespeople are tactical, right? So they're good at, what do I got to do today? What do I got to do next week? What they're not good at is changing the ratio of how much time they're being reactive. Right? If I pulled you together as a salesperson on a Friday and said, tell me about your visits next week. The visits they have planned for the next week are largely reactive ones. Somebody called them up and said, I want to see you, or I need you to come deal with this, whatever it is. Very few of them are things that are part of, well, my account plan said that in the first quarter, I was going to talk to their engineering manager about whiteboard things that they want to go do. And so this is where I think the most help is needed, is in the long-term planning, which is, if you go through that wheel we talked about, right at the beginning of it is the account plan. And in the account plan, you should always be thinking 12 months out, right? And it's a rolling 12 months. Now, the problem I think we get into with account plans is that people think about them just for a calendar year. But what are you doing in September? You should be thinking all the way through the following September. So I say I should have a perpetual sliding 12-month window that I'm planning to. And I might not know now, here in December, that I'm going to meet with this person on April 12th at 10 o'clock in the morning. But I do know that sometime in the second quarter, I want to have a meeting with this person to talk about X, because it's part of my plan to drive the account forward. So I'll put that into my plan. And as I get closer, I'll firm it up. But I've laid out this plan. And what I tell salespeople they should do, I think about my early days as a salesperson. Friday afternoon was always when I kind of sit and I'd look at the week ahead, right? And I'd look at it and say, okay, this is the stuff I have scheduled. And then I figure out, what else should I be doing? And that's when you're being proactive. And so if I say the worst salespeople, they're 100% reactive. They wait for the phone to ring and they react when the phone rings. The better the salesperson you are, the higher percentage of your time you're taking control of it by being proactive. And on a Friday afternoon, you're going to say, okay, this is what I have built out. Now I'm going to go back to all my account plans. And I'm going to say, what did I say I was going to do during the month of December? Which of these should I be doing next week? Or I'm going to be in Warsaw on Wednesday. What customers do I have in Warsaw that I have an account plan action I want to try to drive? I can hit that on Wednesday. And that's what the best salespeople do. And what a sales manager should do is coaching their people to do that if they're not already. And that's why that window, to me, needs to be 12 months out, so that you're really thinking big and not just reacting.
Yeah, now I recall in my head my calendar. It's usually planned like probably half year up front. Not necessarily with the selling processes, yeah, but with various elements which I do have on my schedule. But anyway, this is quite far away from now, I would say.
Yeah, and you have to think that way.
You mentioned you wrote a book. What's the title?
So the title is Stop Kidding Yourself. And it's because I think most managers, they delude themselves in thinking they're doing a good job as a manager because they're keeping their boss happy. And that's unfortunately what's happening. And as opposed to, are you taking care of your people? Because to me, the job one of any leader, whether you're a sales leader or anything, your job is to make your people more effective than they would be without you. And you don't do that by doing their job for them. You do it by helping them to develop. And like I said, I was very fortunate early in my career to have some incredible coaches that, again, took the young idiot and helped turn him into a decent salesperson. And what I'm trying to do with the book is return sales management to that as the focus. And I'm not saying nobody's doing it. The best of them do it. But too many managers today, because all this data is there, and because that's what the corporation wants, they get sucked into spending most of their time on that reporting side, as opposed to being out in front of customers with their salespeople and then coaching their salespeople on how to do better.
Who should read this book? Is it for the selling teams or for the management or for other clients who should understand how the selling teams should work?
But I mean, my intended audience is just any sales leader. You know, it's not really, or a salesperson who wants to be a sales leader is a good target for this book. But if you're a sales leader or you're someone who's over a sales leader, you're like a president of a division or something, and you're trying to figure out how could I help my sales leader run better, a lot of the answers are in here.
I can imagine that every book has special sections, yeah? So various of them. Which one of yours book do you think is the most important?
Well, you know, it's funny because my readers have told me the part that they gravitate to the most. There's a chapter in the book on coaching. It's called Coaching Like You Mean It. And that's the one that I get the most questions on. It's the one that seems to resonate with people the most, which I love because to me, that's the most important thing. That's what's been lost is the art of coaching. Because what most people do with coaching, they forget what coaching is. They think coaching is telling someone what to do. And that's not what real coaching, which is hard, is Socratic. It's, I'm going to ask you questions so you tell yourself what you want to do. It's harder. You have to be thoughtful. You have to be willing to be patient and step back. But if I tell you what to do, you're only going to do it because I told you. But if I help you to understand what you want to do and you tell yourself what you need to do, oh, you're sure as heck going to do it because you're telling yourself you need to do it. And to me, that's the essence of great coaching. I tell a story in a book of a really strong salesperson who became a sales leader, but he made a big mistake when he went out there. He was assigned a bunch of very experienced, very capable salespeople. And he went out on sales visits with them. And what he would do is say, all right, you sit there and watch me. I'll handle the call and watch what I do and then learn. That's not how you do it. What you do is you go in and you listen. You let the salesperson do it and you listen and you pay attention. You contribute where you can. And at the end, you would just have a conversation with the salesperson saying, well, how do you think that went? They tell you. And you say, well, if you could go back in time, is there anything you'd want to do differently? Da-da-da. And then you can ask some questions about, well, when you said this, what were you trying to accomplish with the customer? If you had said it this way, what do you think the reaction would have been? That's Socratic coaching, that at the end of it, the salesperson is going to tell themselves what they should have done differently.
So perhaps your book is not about selling, but about coaching.
It's more about, I mean, it's specific to both things, but I'll tell you, coaching to me is the essence of everything. Whether you're a sales leader or any leader, if you have the experience, you want to be a good coach. And I think one of the challenges we've had is that a lot of people that become sales managers because they were a good salesperson, which does not necessarily mean that they're a good coach. And so when you hire a sales manager, your focus in thinking about who that person is how good a coach are they? To me, that should be the number one criteria. I don't care if they were particularly successful as a salesperson. I hope they were. But just taking your number one salesperson and making him a sales leader is often a path to failure.
Just the last question, but concerning something what is now like a growing element, I mean the technology and the AI. Do you think that this can be supportive or rather not supportive for being successful selling leader?
I think, and this would merit a whole other conversation, but I think AI, if used properly, can really enhance what a salesperson does. Because what the AI can do is help the salesperson to decide what they should be focused on. The average salesperson I work with has over 100 deals in play at any given time. Oftentimes, their focus comes from what are the biggest deals, but those aren't necessarily the best ones for them to focus on. And what an AI can help, it can be an objective judge that says, well, I think these are the 5 deals you should be focused on, because you can't focus on 100. That's what AI can bring to the equation. And I think it can add a lot of value. That's now the data can work on my side. If I put an AI on the data, the AI can help me use that data to decide what I should be focusing on. And I used to work with this great guy named Harvey Dunham, and he used to say, where we focus, we win. And that's a great saying for a salesperson, for any job, really. Where you focus, you win.
And AI helps us with focusing.
Yeah. It can if you use it right.
Yeah, definitely, of course. Charles, it was a pleasure to have you on my podcast and talking about selling process, selling leaders, some mistakes, some advices, and also about your book. If somebody wanted to get your book, where can people find it?
Just go to Amazon.com, type in Stop Kidding Yourself, and it'll come right up. It's available as an ebook or as a physical book. And you can get it anywhere in the world. The only thing I apologize, it's only available in English.
Oh, I can imagine that most of business people do speak English.
Yeah.
And if somebody wanted to talk to you, where to find you?
Best way to reach out to me is through LinkedIn. You can find me just as Charles Forsgard on LinkedIn, and that'll get you right to me.
So I will make sure those two links are attached to our conversation in the description of this podcast. So this will allow you, our listeners and viewers, to find Charles quicker and get the book. Reading books is good. Getting good advices is always good. So I fully recommend to go to this page and get your copy of the book. Charles, it was a pleasure. Thank you very much for today.
Pleasure talking to you, Victor. Thank you for the opportunity.